Let's now focus on learning objective C, and we're going to determine if a function has a maximum or a minimum, and if there's any relative, or what are called local, max and minimum extrema. So the first thing we need to do is talk about this vocabulary. You are familiar with max and minimums, but you may not be familiar with relative or local max and mins. What a max or a minimum is of a function means look at the function as a whole. Does the function as all of it together have a one maximum value or one minimum value? So for example, if we look at this first graph right here, this graph goes towards positive infinity, so there's not a particular maximum value, and it goes to negative infinity, so there's not a minimum value. This graph has neither a maximum or a minimum. However, if I switch the vocab and if I said relative or local, and both of these mean the same thing, if I said relative minimum or relative maximum, this graph has each of them. What relative means is this. If you look at a particular section of the graph, and I'm going to isolate and just look at this section right here. If you look at that section, does it have a minimum point or a maximum point? Is there a spot where it bottoms out or tops out? It does. Right here is the bottom. This here is called a relative minimum. Now, if we look at another section, what if I isolate and just look at this little section of the graph? Is there a relative minimum or relative maximum? Sure. As you travel in just this portion, there is a maximum point it reaches, which is right here. So this does have a relative maximum. So if you look at the four choices below, this graph actually is this box of information right here. Let's move on to the second graph and see if we can determine if it has a max or a min as a whole, and then if there's any relative maxes or mins. Now looking at this guy, you're going to see it goes all the way to positive infinity on both sides. So there's not a complete maximum. But is that the graph as a whole have a final minimum value? It does. It's right there. So point C is called the minimum. Now there are a handful of relative max and mins on this graph. If you look at it and just isolate like this section, and let's look at this section here. We'll just look at all of these little sections. You should be able to notice that there are a variety of mins and maxes. So what you're seeing here, actually is the minimum of the function, but it's also a relative minimum of that section. This is a relative max, this is a relative min, that's a relative max, and this one here is a relative min. So graph number 2 actually coincides with the words right below it. Okay, continuing on, let's look at graph number 3. Now as a whole, this graph does have a maximum, it's at h. As a whole, it does not have a minimum because it goes to negative infinity. So there's no min, but there is a maximum. Now relative, if I just take a sector of this little section right here does have a maximum, it's at h, but there is no minimum. So this graph matches up with this vocab. And then by default, obviously graph number 4 is going to go here. There's no relative min, no relative max, and no min on any part of the graph whatsoever. Now if we go back to this example we used for finding the x and y intercepts, we already have the graph in the calculator. If they want us to use the calculator to find the relative mins or max, we can do that. Now let's actually look at this, for example, and talk about if there's mins or maxes. The min of this graph, there is no particular min because it goes down here to negative infinity. There is no max because it goes to positive infinity. But is there a relative min or is there a relative max? If we take a look at it, we can see right here that's going to be a maximum. And then if we do another one, we're going to have a minimum down here. So remember, how do you find those? Well, this problem wants us to find the relative minimum, so this one right here. So after we have it graphed, we're going to want to try to get to this word calculate. So you have to hit second trace, and then you're going to get this screen. You choose if you want minimum or maximum. We want the minimum. So I hit select min. Now it's going to say left bound and right bound. It's first going to say left bound, so go anywhere to the left of the graph. Over here, hit enter. Then it's going to say right bound. So scroll over anywhere over here, hit enter. Then it's going to say, do you want me to guess? Hit enter, yes. And when you do, it'll wrap up and it'll give you the answer right down here. So the ordered pair here happens at -2, and then -108. Now, if they did want you to find the relative max, you're going to isolate this point. You're going to do second calc or trace, and you do want to just select maximum and go ahead and do the same steps.